Thank you for being here today. Welcome everyone to our Climate Insight webinar. I'm Simon Lalieu, consultant at Climate. Along with my talented colleagues Jeanne Dumoulin and Adrien Lefebvre, today we are going to deep dive into the planetary boundaries at Belgian level. What does it mean? Does Belgium exceed its fair share of the planetary boundary? And how do planetary boundaries relate to your company's environmental objectives? First, practicalities. We'll be there to handle your question in the Q&A chat, so do not hesitate to write them in the chat. We will respond orally or in writing. Please note that the webinar is recorded, so the replay will be available as well as an executive summary of the report. We have a busy schedule, so let's stick to it. First, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to climate, to the context of planetary boundaries and why it's important. Then, Jeanne and Adrien will present what planetary boundaries means at the Belgian level. And after the methodology, we'll take one first round of questions. Moving on with Adrien, he will conclude with the main messages of the study. And we'll finish with a Q&A session with your question in the chat. So the ecological challenges are many: climate change, biodiversity, water, pollution, and others. And several frameworks exist to take a holistic view of these dimensions. They complement each other. For companies, for instance, the CSR directive requires companies to report and act on their impact on the environment. The SDGs provide companies and government with monitoring indicators for sustainable development. Finally, the country-level planetary boundaries indicate what share a state carries for exceeding or not the planetary boundaries. And this is the subject of today's webinar. Climate is evolving to meet the changing needs of companies and public authorities. Things are changing rapidly, as we are seeing with the CSR directive, and Climate can help you. With strategic consulting for companies or prospective studies for public authorities, Climate is empowering its client to act on climate and environment. In this context, Climate had the opportunity to lead a study on planetary boundaries at Belgian level, commissioned by the CERAC, a new independent federal center. And today, with the precious intervention of Luc Bass, director of the CERAC, who will present the CERAC and why it's important to study planetary boundaries at Belgian level. Luc, the floor is yours.
Bij mij staat hij aan. Okay, I will start again. I was apparently muted. So anyway, thanks for inviting me to this very important webinar, which I saw from the list of participants gets a lot of attention, which is really good. Yes, so the CERAC asked Climact, or had a tender for assessing the planetary boundaries at the Belgian level, which hadn't been done yet, and is important for CERAC as a basis for looking at how we can and where we can put emphasis in the analysis that we will have to do. But of course, you need to understand what CERAC is. CERAC is a new center, an independent center that is to analyze predominantly climate risk for Belgium. But by extension, its mandate also asks it to look at other planetary boundaries. And of course, to know which ones are the most transgressed in Belgium, we needed to know where to start, and therefore this study is of utter importance. The reason that CERAC exists is, in fact, a decision from the Minister Council from 21 after the terrible floodings in Wallonia, and where the governments sought to have a better view and a better assessment of what is at us on climate risks, and of course non-climatic risks that are involved and that are underlying often the gravity of the disasters that have happened. An unfortunate heavy disaster and that crisis led to CERAC being mandated, not just to do the risk analysis as such, but also to advise the National Security Council in Belgium and to anticipate when these challenges can become security challenges. That's not a coincidence either. It's not just the crisis and the disaster in that happened in Wallonia in 2021, but it's also part of the national security strategy. So therefore, the center is needed also to advise the national security better. There is a Belgian National Resilience Plan that we contribute to in this context, but more importantly, now after we've done this analysis, and of which you will hear many more details during the webinar, we have decided that our climate risk analysis will be accompanied with also an analysis on the risk of the biodiversity loss, as that is the second dominant risk also identified through this study, which will lead us to insights on how the climate and biodiversity loss challenge are connected and how one and the other can hopefully also be analyzed together, and therefore measures can be put in place that benefit both. I will not go on much longer, just to say that we are extremely happy with the collaboration with Climact and the output in this first downscaling of the planetary boundaries for Belgium. There are many methodological challenges, and you will hear more, I think, during the webinar. Many disclaimers to be made, and of course, nothing is ever fully or perfect or in a full analysis. That's also impossible, given the large amount of the environmental challenges that are upon us. But it is the first time that these are being brought together in this concept, and I think will further guide us through the years in how we further develop the work at the CERAC. So again, a big thank you and congratulations to the team that have developed this study. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Luc. So as far as I'm concerned, what I take from what you've said is that first, CERAC still has a major role to play in reducing environmental risks in Belgium. And second, that this study is exploratory and, of course, has its limitation. So let's deep dive into our planetary boundaries and the study. The planetary boundaries concept presents a set of 9 boundaries that keep the planet in a state that allow humanity to prosper. Once you transgress one, the risks start multiplying. Crossing boundaries increases the risk of generating large-scale, abrupt, or irreversible environmental changes. The planetary boundaries are also deeply interrelated, but climate change and biodiversity are core boundaries. They impact all others. And since 2009, the planetary boundary framework has been revised several times, with a wide range of scientific researches. Of course, it is a simplified version of reality, and therefore it has its limitation, as Luc mentioned. But the trend is clear now. We are moving from the safe operating space for humanity on Earth. A recent study in 2023 concludes that 6 of the 9 boundaries have been transgressed at the global level. And this was for planetary boundaries at global level, but planetary boundaries are also assessed at national level. The Belgian study is based on best practices of these studies. In 2013, Sweden published the first study on planetary boundaries at national level. Then the Dutch and New Zealand, their study. The EEA conducted a study at the European level, and this was the first study on a supranational level. The French study has been published, and finally, the study for Flanders and a study for a region in the north of Germany are the first studies on a regional scale. So as you can see, the framework is being used more and more. And last but not least, Belgium has published its study, which we are going to present you today. The Belgian study has enabled the concept of planetary boundary to evolve, in particular by linking it to the notion of risks. But the planetary boundaries framework is not limited to countries. We are fortunate to have a mixed audience today. We have public authorities, of course, companies, scientists, and others. And we can't talk about everything in details today, of course. But for companies, planetary boundaries also concern you. As we will see, the CSR directive is strongly linked with the planetary boundaries. On climate change, obviously, both the CSR directive and planetary boundaries include climate indicators focusing on reducing GHG emissions. Then, the CSRD mandates reporting on pollution, including chemical use and waste management, and this is linked to the biogeochemical boundary or to air quality. The CSRD encompasses water use, aligning with the boundary for the global water cycle. And last but not least, both the CSRD and planetary boundary cover biodiversity impacts. So the planetary boundary framework can be used at company level, but it can also be scaled up at supranational level. And public authorities today operate within a European regulatory framework linked to planetary boundaries. By achieving climate neutrality by 2050 under the European Climate Law, by protecting, preserving, and restoring biodiversity under the Nature Restoration Law, or in more general by pursuing a zero pollution ambition, including for air, water, and soil. And that's why these concepts have been studied on a Belgian scale. More specifically, this study shows that the Belgian environmental footprint in relation to the Belgian fair share of the global planetary boundaries. The main message of this figure and of the study is that 5 out of the 6 planetary boundaries have been exceeded at the Belgian level. You can see in this figure that the green circle designs the Belgian boundaries. If you're in the green circle, you will not exceed the Belgian boundary. The more you move forward towards orange and red colors, the more you enter in a zone of uncertainty or risk. The rest of this webinar will help you understand these results. And now it's the time to tell more about the methodology behind the study and behind the planetary boundaries at Belgian level. So I give the floor to Jeanne.
Thank you very much, Simon. So first of all, 6 out of the 9 planetary boundaries were selected, as Simon said, for assessment in this study. Freshwater, biogeochemical cycles, land use, biosphere integrity, climate change, and aerosols. So the first 5 were selected because they are relevant to Belgium, because the methodologies for assessing them are robust, and because the needed data are available. The 6th one, aerosols, was chosen because air quality is an issue in Belgium. On the other hand, ocean acidification is closely correlated with climate change. The CO2 concentration in the ocean is correlated with the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Novel entities is a planetary boundary that was not quantified until 2023 in the last global study. And ozone depletion is an issue that has been well understood for a number of years now. So therefore, these 3 have not been selected for assessment in this study. For each planetary boundary to be downscaled, a specific methodology has been followed, involving 3 distinct steps. So the first step is to define the control variable that will be used to assess the planetary boundary. What is analyzed behind climate change, for example? The control variable is the indicator that will be studied. For climate change, an indicator could be the cumulative emissions since 1850, for instance. The second step is to estimate the Belgian fair share of the boundary, to downscale the global boundary into a boundary that is specific to Belgium. By doing so, it allows to estimate the Belgian safe operating space, the safe zone for Belgium, the green circle you see on the plot. The third step is to measure the footprint. This is the actual impact of Belgium on the planetary boundary. It allows us to compare it with the Belgian boundary. Do we transgress the boundary? How many times? Those are the questions we will be able to answer after that. So the choice of control variables, for example, is linked to the availability of data for Belgium, to the methodology behind it, and its relevance to the territory. Then for the downscaling, the step 2, this is done by allocating the fair share of the planetary boundary. Depending on how you see the problem, the allocation key can be different. This step is quite interesting because it raises several ethical questions. So I will take some time to explain it in more details afterwards. And then the footprint can be estimated using different approaches that limit the scope of the estimation, whether it is the impact of Belgian production that is being studied. So that's the impact of all products being produced on Belgium's territory, or the impact of Belgium's consumption. So the impact of all products that are consumed in Belgium, even if products are made elsewhere. The last approach is the territorial approach, which analyzes the impact observed on the territory. So just for you to know, at global level, there is no need of production and consumption concerns when considering the whole planet. That is why those concepts are introduced when scaling the concept to national level. Here is a small illustration table. The choice of the control variable gives then the unit. The downscale Belgian boundary is, for example, 100, and the Belgian footprint is measured at 150 based on the production, or 175 based on the consumption approach. Here you can see in this example that the footprint transgresses the boundary, both for production and consumption. So it is important to note that the results can be different, as they are the consequences of all the choices we had to make upstream. So that's why methodology is so important to understand. I will now focus on the second step, because the choices made at this stage are quite important and raise, as I said already, ethical concerns. There are several principles that can be used to downscale the global boundary, each of which expresses the way we see the problem. We have chosen not to have one strict value for the limits, but to have a range of values by using 3 different approaches, giving 3 different limits. You have a conservative approach for the upper boundary, which gives more room for maneuver, a reference approach, which gives an intermediate value for the boundary, and a progressive approach, which gives a lower boundary. The conservative approach is called grandfathering. It says that we should maintain the statu quo of the distribution of impacts between countries. In other terms, big polluters have bigger right to pollute. The in-between limit is given by the per capita approach. It says that every human being in the world has the same right to use resources or to pollute. So every citizen gets an equal share of the allocation. Then the progressive approach is the right to development approach, which states that less developed countries need more resources than developed countries because the latter have used and polluted resources for the development in the past. After applying the calculations behind each method, the allocation factors are expressed as a percentage of the global limit that can be allocated to Belgium. Here is an illustration for climate change. The global boundary is set by the framework at 2,800 billion tons of CO2 to be emitted like a maximum since 1850 by all countries. The allocation factor is applied to the global boundary to estimate the safe zone for Belgium, the green circle of the radial plot, if you remember well. So, according to the approach that is used, the factors can be quite different, sometimes up to a ratio of 10 between the progressive approach and the conservative one. That is why it is really important to understand the methodology behind the results, as I said already. And then when you have this allocation factor, you can apply them to the global boundary to give 3 different boundaries for comparison with the actual footprint, which is the gray area on the graph. For now on, only the per capita boundary will always be the one used in the radial plot for the sake of clear communication. And now I give the floor back to Simon.
Thank you very much, Jeanne. And Now that we have most of the tools to understand the results, let's us analyze them. So the floor is still to you, Jeanne, to present the footprint of Belgium under the planetary boundaries.
All right, thank you, Simon. So now, place to the results. So you already know the radial plot, which is a snapshot of the results by using the per capita approach to establish the safe zone for Belgium. You have to know that transgressing a boundary is the results of the country standards of living, but as a reminder, the results of the methodological choices we made upstream. Here today, 5 control variables will be presented. The one of climate change, biosphere integrity, blue water, nitrogen cycle for the biogeochemicals flows, and forest use for the land use. The results display both the production-based and consumption-based footprints when possible, as you can see on the graph, which is not the case for the global study and the graph related to it. So for each planetary boundary presented here, we will follow the 3-step methodology that I explained to you a few slides ago. So first, the definition of the boundary by the chosen control variable. This is the indicator we will measure. Second, the limits for Belgium calculated using the per capita approach. And then third, the number of times Belgium exceeds its limits based on its production and consumption. And then, on the basis of these results, key messages can be formulated for companies, public authorities, and civil society. So let's begin with the first one, climate change. So the climate change boundary is studied by estimating the cumulated Belgium's CO2 emissions since 1850. As Belgians, we should not emit more than 4 billion tons of CO2 since 1850 to limit the temperature rise of 1 degree. So the planetary boundary framework considered that 1 degree implies entering a zone of uncertainty. The impact of Belgium's production, the products made within Belgium, equals 3.4 times the boundary. It means that since 1850, Belgium emitted around 15 billion tons of CO2, which corresponds to 3.4 times 4 billion tons of CO2. While the impact of Belgian consumptions, the impact of all products consumed in Belgium, even if produced elsewhere, equals 4.4 times the boundary. Our consumption has therefore a bigger impact than our production in Belgium. The key messages for companies to remind of are the fact that, like consumption emissions, it is essential to measure and act on Scope 3 emissions. In parallel, for public authorities, it is essential to remind and use the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. Countries with large historical emissions must reduce faster. Also, public policies can have a strong impact on production emissions, while consumption should be also considered in policies. Now, let's talk about biodiversity. So the biodiversity boundary is studied using an indicator called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, the BII. By using it, we estimate the share of lost biodiversity compared to the biodiversity of the Holocene era. The global study of planetary boundary established that only 10% of the biodiversity could be lost before entering a zone of uncertainty. And this is an indicator that we can apply to a region or a country itself. This is a territorial indicator, giving information on what is observed on the territory, and not information on the impact that can be imputed to Belgium's production and consumption. The Belgian footprint is actually equal to 3.5 times the boundary of 10%. So it equals to 35% of biodiversity loss. Because of the natural habitat destruction due to cropland, deforestation, soil artificialization, pollution, So transgressing it that much makes Belgium entering within the high risk zone in red. That is why, like targets for climate, companies should set targets and act for biodiversity. The agro industry, for example, should focus on agroecological products, and the construction industry should avoid artificialized new lands. On the public authority side, there is enough knowledge about Belgium's biodiversity to pursue ambitious policies and ensure that they are restrictive and well monitored. On the other hand, more research is needed on the impacts in other parts of the world. For all actors, it is really important to know that we should act not only because the risk is quite high, but also because of the ecosystemic services biodiversity ensures by considering all co-benefices on sectors like health, like agri-food. So that's it for me now and for biodiversity and climate change. Adrien will now take the floor to present you the results of the other downscale planetary boundaries.
Thank you, Jeanne. And now let's move on to the last three boundaries that we will discuss today. Starting with the biogeochemical cycles. So for this boundary, two elements have been studied in the study, both the phosphorus and the nitrogen cycles. And only the nitrogen cycle and boundary will be presented here, but we refer you to the final study if you're also interested in Belgium's impact on the phosphorus cycle. And now, let's take a closer look at how Belgium contributes to disrupting the global nitrogen cycle. First, it's important to clarify what is included in this boundary. So this includes really all the nitrogen that ends up in the ecosystem. So this can come directly from fertilizers that are applied on croplands by farmers, but also indirectly in the manure of farm animals or captured by certain types of crops. And so all these sources combined should not exceed 92,000 tons of nitrogen for Belgium, if we consider a per capita allocation. And this is quite challenging to reach for Belgium, as we're quite an agriculture-oriented country using many fertilizers in our production. And we also produce a lot of swine and cattle, whose manure releases also a lot of nitrogen to the environment. And so, as you can see, both our domestic production and our consumption are not aligned with our allocated boundary, which is exceeded by more than a factor of 4. So this excessive amount of nitrogen in the environment causes negative consequences on both aquatic ecosystem, on biodiversity, on climate, etc., to name a few. But solutions exist, and companies can lead the way in the right direction. Agri-food industries, for instance, can leverage their network of suppliers to produce with more environmentally friendly practices, for example. Public authorities also have an important role to play in reducing our nitrogen footprint. A first example is through policies. Policies can target nitrogen emissions in Belgium. An example of such a measure was the nitrogen decree a few years ago. But policies can also put more stringent constraints on the type of products that Belgian companies are allowed to import, and hence that we consume in Belgium. For instance, by forbidding the import of goods that use too many inputs. Public authorities finally can also contribute by financially supporting farmers in implementing better agroecological practices. The next boundary that we have assessed is land use, for which also two control variables have been studied. So we have assessed the forest land control variable and the croplands. In this presentation, we will only present the forest land boundary, as this variable is the most recently and most often used boundary in the studies. For the forest land, the control variable looks at how much of the initial forest cover has been deforested today. Different boundaries have been set depending on the types of forests we consider. For temperate forests, as we have here in Belgium, the framework defines a boundary of 50% deforestation of the primary forest cover. And in Belgium, our forests have lost a lot of ground in the past, especially with the Industrial Revolution, which razed many Belgian forests, but also with the Agricultural Revolution. And as a result, 80% of our initial forest has disappeared, significantly exceeding the boundary. Again, solutions exist to revert this trend, and companies and public authorities have an important role to play. Companies, for instance, can invest in recycling and the reuse of products to reduce their consumption of primary wood resources. But they can also proactively contribute to this boundary by financing reforestation projects. Public authorities, they already engage in this direction and can push this effort even further. For instance, they can support an even better forest management practices and guidelines to ensure a sustainable use of our forests. They can also implement policies to incentivize industries to recycle and reuse goods. And they can also set up guidelines to ensure that the reforestation projects in which companies will invest actually reach their objectives. That these projects don't become a right to pollute, but instead deliver the expected ecosystemic services. The last planetary boundary we have studied refers to blue water. Here, we look at the volume of blue water that can be consumed without disrupting the global blue water cycle. Our consumption of blue water can take many forms. The most obvious ones are the water that we consume in our daily life, to drink or to wash, but water is also used in the agriculture, for irrigation or for farm animals. Our industry also consumes a lot of water to produce certain goods, or for the production of energy. And so, all these activities together should consume less than 6 cubic kilometers of blue water if we follow a per capita allocation of the global boundary. And actually, as you can see on the graph, we're quite below this boundary in Belgium. This means that our activities in Belgium do not contribute to disrupting the global blue water cycle. Our consumption, on the other hand, is slightly bigger and even exceeds this boundary. And this is mainly due to our many imports that consume lots of water, and we can think of soy and other agricultural products used for animal feed, but also our imports of industrial goods, such as textile, for instance. One particular point of attention is that Belgium is also considered by many studies as a country prone to water risk. And this statement is not contradictory with the study's finding stating that Belgium lives within its blue water boundary. And this is because water stress and the blue water boundary do not compare the same concepts. Water stress compares our consumption with the amount of water available in the country. The blue water boundary, on the other hand, compares our consumption with a fair share of water that Belgium can consume. This fair share amount is independent of the water available in the country and is even bigger than those blue water resources, which explains why Belgium can still be water stressed while remaining within its safe operating space for this boundary. And again, solutions exist, and industries and public authorities are key to improve the management of our blue water resources. Companies can contribute by reducing the water consumption in their processes. And when they consume water through their imports, companies can also limit the consumption of those products from typically water-stressed countries. Public authorities also are key by implementing national targets and constraints to limit our water usage and hence reduce the risk of water stress during certain times of years. And so that finalizes the discussion of the results from the study. And in conclusion, we can see that from this exercise, if we consider a per capita allocation for our boundary, we observe that Belgium exceeds all 6 boundaries both from a production and consumption perspective, the only exception being the blue water boundary, for which our domestic consumption lies below our fair share for the reasons that we explained previously. We also observe that systematically, the footprint from our consumption is bigger than our production. And this means that first, we consume more than we produce, but also the products that we import are often produced with less stringent regulations and so have a worse impact on the environment in the foreign country than if they were produced here. And by worse, we mean that they consume more fertilizers, more water, causes deforestation, or emit more CO2. So Belgium exceeds its safe operating space for almost all planetary boundaries. But solutions exist. And for each boundary, both companies and public authorities have solutions to help Belgium return within this safe operating space. Companies are part of the solution. They can contribute through different actions and measures. For instance, by increasing environmental requirements for imported goods, by supporting local projects that aim to restore biodiversity or reforest. They can also reduce their emissions through phasing out fossil fuels. They can reduce their water consumption, etc., etc. Public authorities and civil society also have the power to encourage this return to a safe operating space. This can be done by uniting all actors behind a common goal and implementing ambitious environmental policies, but also by closely monitoring the efforts made in this direction. So solutions exist, and we have the power to leverage this solution. So now it's important to act. And I will give the floor back to my colleague Simon.
Thank you very much, Adrien, and thank you, Adrien and Jeanne, for this presentation. We've generated a lot of questions in the chat. So we have made a selection for this webinar, and we'll follow up the others' question by email. So a first question for you, Jeanne. On the methodology, why did you select the per capita allocation method in the radial plot in particular?
Thank you, Simon, and the one who asked the question, of course. But you have to know that every study that downscale the planetary boundaries have used this method. And some studies have used this method plus other methods like we did. So that's a method that is the most used and the most simple to understand, also based on the principle, the equality principle that is quite accessible to available to everybody. So that's why we used it to compare our results to the results of other studies, national, international. But you have to know also that in the report that will be published by the CERAC, there are figures for each planetary boundaries that presents the three limits all the time. So you do not have only this one that is within the report, that's for sure. And the radial plot could be made for each of the methods, of course.
Wonderful, thank you, Jeanne. Another methodological question, and more especially on biodiversity probably. What is the difference between territorial and production-based footprint?
So it's actually slightly different and very similar, but different still, because some impacts of other countries' production, for example, the France is producing some products on its territory, will impact the territory of Belgium as well. Like we did not talk about aerosols for the moment, air quality, but you have pollution that is made, that is produced elsewhere, and that can impact our territories. That's why territorial approach is quite different. It's slightly different than production approach. But for biodiversity, it's also interesting to know that that's the limitations of downscaling the planetary boundaries concept to a country. Biodiversity does not stop at borders, actually. So everything must be taken really cautiously.
Thank you, Jeanne. A question on climate change. So for climate change, we accounted both the impact of imported goods and national production. It is the production and the consumption-based footprint. So the question is it expected for a country like Belgium to have a higher consumption footprint than production? And so production emissions are those that occurs in Belgium, industry, space heating, transport, etc. Emission from consumption, which are higher for Belgium, take into account emissions for goods and services consumed in Belgium, even if they were not produced in Belgium. And so for Belgium, which is a very import-export economy compared with France, for example, our emissions from consumption are higher than those for production. And this is because we import and export a lot of goods and services. Of course, as it has been said, public authorities can put targets and can act on consumption emission as well. But I have now a question for Adrien. Adrien, a question in the chat on the biogeochemical cycles, so nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. So the question is, what could be the place of nitrogen and phosphorus recovery in wastewater treatment plants in the trajectory to reduce Belgium impact on these boundaries?
Yes, so it's important to identify first where those emissions of nitrogen and phosphorus come from, and the share of those pollutions from cities, so that end up in urban wastewater or in industrial wastewater, is quite small and negligible compared to the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus pollution from agricultural activities, so fertilizers, but also animal slurry that is being spread on fields. And so the capture of nitrogen from urban activities is a little part of the solution, but is negligible compared to the bigger amount of nitrogen, which is a more diffuse pollution, and so more difficult to capture once emitted. And so the solution for nitrogen and phosphorus is not to capture nitrogen and phosphorus after it has been emitted and emitted on the fields, but rather to limit the amount that is being emitted and to anticipate the issue instead of solving the issue after it occurs.
Thank you, Adrien. There is an also very interesting question. All the questions are interesting in the chat, of course. On blue water, there is this question that the blue water consumption is defined as a repartition, a share of the global boundary with the per capita share. So as water is a local issue, is it still relevant to use this per capita allocation in this boundary, and what are the limitations of this methodology and of the results for the water boundary?
Yes, so the blue water boundary really highlights an issue and the limitation of this planetary boundary framework, and really highlights instead the contribution of Belgium to the global systems and the global boundaries and frameworks and blue water cycles. And so here what we looked at is really what is the share for a Belgian citizen, one individual, that he can consume for everyone to be on the same, to have his fair share. The planetary boundaries does not look at the local resources and what share must be consumed to avoid any risks at local level. So it's quite important to know that the planetary boundaries has as objective to look at the global cycles and the impact that Belgium has on global issues, and less on small local issues, such as for blue water, but the same can be raised for the biogeochemical cycles, where nitrogen pollution is quite a local issue also. And so those two different questions actually are answered differently for when we use the planetary boundary framework rather than the location-based approach.
Thank you, Adrien. There is another question on nitrogen. So we know that nitrogen is a very important issue in Belgium. And so intuitively, wouldn't Belgium have a bigger nitrogen footprint for its production and not consumption? Could you explain a bit why maybe you need the slide to show that there is a small difference for the between
Yes.
production and consumption footprints, and it's not very intuitive.
Yes, so if you can show the slides again. Yes. So going to the biogeochemical cycles.
Yeah, so the slide number 23.
Yes. Yeah, so we can see that for Belgium, well, first, we see that both in our production and consumption-based footprint, the limit is exceeded by a significant amount, so more than 4 times. So this first highlights the issue that we're having in Belgium linked to our agricultural practices and nitrogen. And yes, it would make sense to think that our production footprint would be even higher because it's our own production, our own fertilizers, and the manure produced by our swine in Flanders that emit this nitrogen locally. But actually, you have to also consider the bigger picture, and all the Belgian cattle also is being fed with animal feed that is being produced in foreign countries in South America, where the agriculture is typically also fertilizer intensive. And so all these inputs of feed also require and consume a lot of fertilizers, which are accounted for in our consumption footprint and not in our production footprint. And so, yes, our production is quite high due to our activities, but our consumption is also high because of all these imports for our cattle, which makes it slightly higher, but the two are quite similar in terms of values, and both exceed the boundary by a way too large margin and need to be tackled both through improving our practices, but also through improving the products that we import for our animals.
Thank you, Adrien. We'll now move to first a small remark is that do not hesitate to ask for more questions, and we will come back with the one not answered yet. We have another methodological question for Jeanne. So we've seen those ratios between the per capita, grandfathering, and right to development methods, but could you explain a bit what is behind these ratios? So the ratios of 0.03% or 0.3%. Really, what are the numbers that leads to these ratios?
Okay. We can go to slide 16 to be able to see a bit better. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. As I said, there are computations behind and allocation keys, so some parameters into the computations. The per capita, to begin with the easiest one, is only the ratio between the population of Belgium and the world population. So actually, Belgian population is equal to 0.15% of the world population. So that's the idea behind per capita. So as you can see, quite easy. Right to development is a bit less easy. It's also implementing into the calculation the fact that the countries have different human development index, the HDI. I don't know if you are quite familiar to that, but so this human development index is taken into account into the calculations, and it allows the countries that have a high HDI, like Belgium, to produce to have less a lower boundary at the end. And then for the conservative approach, the grandfathering approach, it's actually the impacts of the planetary boundary itself, so the footprint of Belgium compared to the footprint of the world. And that's the ratio of this impact, the Belgian impact compared to the one of the world, that is giving this higher ratio in, for example, in the case of climate change, because 0.31 is the ratio for climate change. So it's so important to note also that the allocation factor for the grandfathering is different for each planetary boundary, while the per capita and the right to development factor are the same because they are based only on parameters of the country and not linked to the planetary boundary itself. I hope it was clear enough.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeanne. So we have a lot of questions in the chat, so I have to select some of them, of course. Adrien, this is a very open question, but very interesting. Is it possible to identify sectors or of activity that contributes to the exceeded boundaries more than other sectors?
Well, yes. First of all the different sectors contribute to exceeding certain boundaries, certain more than others. The climate change boundary is maybe the most important sector that is really that for which all industries and for which all activities contribute to through the burning of fossil fuels. But if there's one activity that really has the biggest detrimental impact on the different boundaries, it has to be the agricultural activity. Through our practices and through the historical choices that have been made in Belgium, well, we have lost a lot of forests. All the fertilizers lead to disrupting the global cycles of certain nutrients that also have an impact on biodiversity. The consumption of blue water for irrigation also is impacted there. The fertilizers have also an impact on the quality of water. And so our current way of producing goods and the choices that we've made to that regard have led to contribute negatively to those boundaries and to the ecosystems that surround them. As those solutions exist, we will not stop producing food, of course, but now we have to produce food while integrating all those boundaries and ecosystems that are crucial for our agriculture and cannot go with that. And so now it's important to rethink the system, to include more agroecological practices, to reduce the use of fertilizers, have a more integrated use of water, etc., to make sure that our agriculture is more in line with the different boundaries and the different ecosystems that they build upon and that they rely on.
Yes. I have an open question for both of you. The question of the reference year of the study. So as you already introduced, the study depends on the data availability for Belgium. So could you very shortly say what are the reference years for the study? Are all the data available for this year, or are some data a bit older than others? So very quickly for the boundaries assessed. Jeanne, Adrien. Maybe you can start with you, Jeanne.
Well, it depends really on the planetary boundary and on the data availability. For example, most of them it's 2021 or 2022 to have the accessible available data that is the most recent. But some of them, like for biodiversity, are a bit are from 2014 because it's based on a big study that took a lot of scientific papers to be able to assess the BII of multiple countries. And it's the British Natural Museum History that made this study, that published it. So that's also why some conclusions of this study is that we need more data to assess it even better. Considering that the fact that it's a snapshot, of course, so it's really important to know the reference here.
Adrien, what about the nitrogen, water, either enough recent data at the regional and Belgian level to do this study?
Yeah, so for nitrogen and phosphorus, we considered the regional data from the regional departments of agriculture and environment. So their data was available until 2021 for nitrogen and phosphorus. We also considered for the emissions linked to manure data from the FAO, which went until 2021 as well. For forest lands, we used data from StatBel, which is the Belgian Statistics Center, which goes until 2022, if I remember correctly. And for blue water, we took also the different regional water statistics, so from the Walloon region, Flemish region, and Brussels region, and their data also went until 2020 and 2021, depending on the region. So it's never really the most recent data, so 2023, but a snapshot from 2021 also gives quite an appropriate and recent view of the Belgian footprint on those compared to those boundaries.
Excellent, thank you, Adrien. Another very interesting question on the right to development results. So, as we've seen, the radial plot use the per capita allocation as many other countries do. But how would if we had used the right to development per capita allocation method instead, how would that change the radial plot? So, in another sense, what are the results if we only take the right to development, so the most ambitious allocation methods into account? So maybe you can start with Jeanne.
So right to development is giving an allocation factor that is lower than the per capita. So just the safe operating space on the radial plot is actually meaning limits that is way lower than the ones for the per capita. That's also why we are overshooting more when already overshot for the per capita, each of the planetary boundaries. And for blue water, I let Adrien continue, maybe.
It's quite similar. Also, the right to development boundary will also be lower. Yeah, the right to development boundary will also be lower compared to the per capita boundary, because it's actually the same allocation factors that are being applied to a global boundary. For blue water, indeed, if we use the right to development boundary, our blue water consumption domestically would indeed exceed this threshold, and then we would officially have exceeded all 6 boundaries, both from a consumption and production point of view.
Thank you, Adrien, and thank you all. We've come to the end of this webinar, and we haven't been able to answer to all the questions in the chat because there are many of them. We will follow up this question by email. A very short word before closing. First is to thank the CERAC to had given the opportunity to Climate to lead this study. And then on the very key messages, first know that 5 out of the 6 planetary boundaries at the Belgian level are exceeded. We've seen that there is a very higher environmental impact if we consider the consumption of Belgium, and then it's a shared responsibility between companies, between civil society, between NGOs, and between public authorities, of course, to act, to analyze, and finally to act on Belgian environmental footprint and to restore our safe operating space. So, very practical words. There is the study is available online, and we will send you the link of the executive summary and of the complete study with all the methodology and so on by email. So I have to a final word to thank everyone for being here today, and do not hesitate to contact Climact by email. Thank you, everyone.